Dear students, welcome to this video lecture on political risk and international business. So how do we define the political risk? Risk that political decisions, events, and conditions will significantly affect the economic performance of a firm or the expected value of a firm's economic action or decision. We will study two key sources of political risk. One, state fragility, and second, the relationship between state and firms. Let us first understand political risk originating from state fragility. First of all, it is important to underline that state is a necessary institution for economic activities. State acts as a regulator. That means it establishes market and rule of law. It is a distributor of wealth in the economy, so it collects taxes, provides subsidies, and formulates and implements welfare policies. It is a director and planner in the economy, so it plans for regional and sectoral development, development of the human resources, and formulation of the trade policies. And equally importantly, it acts as a market actor, as a procurer of raw materials, and as owner of economic organizations or firms, what we call SOEs, state-owned enterprises. What do we expect from an effective state? First, the rule of law and public order, supervision, resolution, and adjudication of conflicts, economic, social, political, policy, and institutional stability, efficient economic regulation. It should guard against market failure, and it should follow the concept of justice. There should be no systemic discrimination. If a state cannot perform these tasks effectively, it is a fragile or failed state. Some attributes of such a state are loss of physical control over its territory or monopoly of the legitimate use of force, erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, inability to provide reasonable public services, and inability to interact with other states as a full member of the international community. To compute the political risk originating from state fragility, the Center of Systemic Peace has devised an index. These are the elements of a state fragility index, which I have put in 6 color-coded groups. So one is the overall effectiveness and legitimacy of the state as an institution. The second relates to the security aspect. Third, states' dependence on valuable primary sector resources. So here it has put net oil production or consumption. Fourth, the type of the regime, its political effectiveness and legitimacy. Fifth, economic effectiveness and legitimacy. And sixth, the social effectiveness and legitimacy. This is the world map. The colors show the fragility index scores of different countries. As you can see, Scandinavian countries, Canada and Australia are the least fragile states. US, Western Europe, and countries like Chile and Argentina are also quite stable. Several Central African countries and countries like Afghanistan and Iraq score very high on fragility index. You might notice that multinational firms tend not to invest in such countries due to political risks originating from state fragility. Now let us focus on the political risks originating from the state and firm interactions. Scholars have studied how firms respond to and influence their broader political and social environments from 3 theoretical approaches. One, structural approach. Second, resource and capability approach. And third, dynamic approach. Let us understand these in some detail. According to the structural approach, formal political structures influence policy outcomes that govern market and non-market interactions and thus affect firm performance. Firms exhibit 2 strategies to engage with political actors and their policy decisions. First, it can pursue its interests by actively engaging in influencing processes. Second, it can remain passive Instead, it actively anticipates the decisions so that it can adapt in time or exit the economy or scale down its operations in order to cut its losses. Now, the first strategy of actively influencing the policy decisions. This is what we call corporate political activities, which can be defined as corporate attempts to shape government policy in a way favorable to the firm. Firms take three generic strategies in this regard: providing information, offering financial incentives to the decision makers, and constituency building. Firms provide selective information to legislators, regulators, and judiciary, makes political campaign contributions to the decision makers' parties, engages in lobbying, and actively builds public opinions, etc. Now, the next question arises: when does a firm engage in corporate political activities? What are their antecedents? First, when the firm is large, resourceful, and possesses political capabilities. Second, when industry is highly regulated, so that influencing the policy has a payoff. Third, when the firm comes to perceive a specific political issue important for its operations and performance. Fourth, when the collective good is missing in the current institution. In this case, the firm projects itself as an institutional leader which transforms the policies in favor of the industry or the society at large, rather than brazenly pursuing its own self-interest. And last but not the least, when corporate political activity is considered legal and ethical in a country, and the politicians are capable of delivering demanded policies. Now let us see the conditions in which firms rather take a passive approach to policy decisions. First, when the government policies are already favorable and there is no need of taking activism. Second, when there are restrictive regulations inhibiting firms from participating in government affairs. Third, when a firm lacks in political resources and capabilities. Fourth, when it perceives high political risks in the host country. Sometimes corporate political activities become high-risk strategies because of the distance or hostility between home and host countries. For example, in the middle of a trade war between two countries, it is wiser for the firms from one country not to engage in political activism in another country. Firms follow broadly four strategies in such situations. First, avoidance. It draws minimum attention from the political and the social actors. It is like flying under the radar. Second, compliance. It quickly obeys rules and regulations and tries not to get into any regulatory or political conflict or troubles. Third, circumvention. The firm reconfigures its organizational structure and processes for competitiveness and to circumvent negative effects of regulations or political actions. And fourth, anticipation. It predicts public policies and analyzes interest groups to anticipate responses. The second is RBV, or capability-based approach. Let me explain it by referring to a study conducted by Holborn and Zellner. They argue that multinational firms differ in assessing and managing policy risks from host country governments depending on the risk profile of their own home countries. For example, a Danish and a Brazilian firm would assess the policy risks of investing in Algeria differently. Firms from home countries characterized by political risk seeking, Brazilian firms in our case, are less sensitive to host country policy risks in their international expansion strategy. Such firms have generated organizational capabilities of assessing such risks and managing the policymaking processes. These firms expand into riskier countries and attain and defend attractive positions or industry structures. Now at the end, the dynamic approach. Scholars have studied actors and processes that disrupt or transform existing markets, policies, and institutional structures, altering both the market and the non-market environment. So some of the key themes these scholars study are political agenda setting, social movements, and cross-national diffusion of public policies or policy instruments. Let me give you an example. Let us suppose that there is an energy company which excels in renewable technologies and it has entered in a developing country like China or India. It can influence the policymakers by pushing sustainability and pollution in the political agenda. It can also try to encourage the green social and consumer movements in these countries. Similarly, it can try to influence the policymakers to adopt European emission targets and industry standards. Now let us briefly review how states approach the foreign firms. Generally, governments are biased towards the domestic firms and can behave more opportunistically with the foreign firms. Scholars have studied the relationship between the host country government and the foreign firms from three approaches. First is the bargaining power approach. Before making an investment, a multinational firm has higher bargaining power vis-à-vis a host country government, as the firm can bring its technologies and capabilities apart from capital to the country. However, when the firm has already made an investment and cannot pull out of the economy without suffering huge losses, its bargaining power gets reduced and its political risks increase. Similarly, when firms' technology is diffused in the host country, firms' bargaining power reduces and its risks increase. The second approach is political institutions approach. Political risks depend on government's ability to intervene based on checks and balances put by the political institutions in the host country. So in countries of weaker institutions, risks are higher. That is why you will see that firms often hesitate from investing in countries with dictatorial regimes and without strong legal and judicial systems, freedom of press, and institutional transparency. The third is legitimacy-based view. Government's motivation to intervene is based on firms' legitimacy. If a foreign firm's operations are considered by host country stakeholders legitimate, it experiences lower political risks. Now let me tell you about an interesting study by Srividya Jandhyal who shows how firms manage their appropriation risks. Multinational firms invest less in host countries in which the governments are likely to alter policies to appropriate its assets opportunistically or renegotiate the terms and conditions of the contract. This is more prevalent in large-scale infrastructure projects in which the company has a high sunk cost. That means it has invested huge amount of capital before the project is operational, and this capital cannot be recovered if the project fails. So the company's bargaining power once it has made the investments is very low. Many such projects are in developing countries with weaker institutions and high political risk. So in 2004, Ramamurthy and Doe studied how Indian government renegotiated the price of electricity and finally cancelled Enron's $2 billion energy project in Maharashtra, which is one of the provinces in India. So what firms do? They involve multilateral development banks like World Bank or Asian Development Banks in the project. Presence of such actors institutionally pressurize the governments from behaving opportunistically and seeking political rent. So at the end, a bit about this week's case, Edificio Spana. It is also about how firms face and manage political risks in a host country. This case is about an investment by the Chinese Wanda Group in Spain, which went sour due to local politics. Please read the case and answer the case questions. We will discuss it in the face-to-face session. So that was it for the video lecture on political risk. In the next video lecture, we talk about the state-owned enterprises.